Welcome, everybody. And I saw the chat, and we can send it out. The music is from some of the young people in our programs, young, incredibly talented people who produced produced the music that you were listening to earlier. So make sure you get that. Welcome, everyone. I'm Courtney Bryan. I am the Executive Director of the Center for Court Innovation. Thank you so much for spending the next 45 minutes with us. I want to start with for those of you who may not be as familiar with the center, we are a national justice reform organization that's dedicated to creating safe, healthy, and thriving communities, and also to creating a justice system that's fair, effective, and humane, and that centers people and racial equity. Today, we're trying something a little new, a sort of lighter touch and short format to bring you greater insight into some of the urgent issues in the field and what we're focused on at the center. And we hope that you'll want to follow up after this conversation and session today with more information and a discussion. So we'll make sure you have our contact information for that. So before I get to my conversation with Darren Johnson, my colleague, I wanted to spend a few minutes on the sort of field and the state of jail reform, beginning with the crisis at Rikers Island here in New York City. I'm sure that many of you have known, seen, been following the coverage of the deteriorating and horrific conditions at Rikers Island, the increase in violence, in deaths, the just unconscionable lack of services, basic services and staffing. And there's just very little light at this moment. But a glimmer of hope is that the current population, the number of people who are incarcerated at Rikers, now around 5,500 people, is about half of what it was 4 years ago. And this is down from a high of 22,000 about 25 years ago. So with COVID aside, this decrease in crime and incarceration over the last 25 years in New York City is thanks in part to a rich network of alternative to incarceration programs, problem-solving courts, alternatives to bail, whether it's through the recent bail legislation or supervised release, a community-based program for those who can be released into the community instead of going to jail while they're awaiting trial. And yet 5,500 people in jail is still too many. Today's population is roughly the same as it was the month before COVID, but it's about 2,000 more than it was at its lowest point ever in April of 2020. However, over the last year or so, as the population has grown and it has increased to now around 5,500, we've seen racial disparities worsening. We know that 90% of people who are held in New York City jails are Black and Hispanic or Latinx. Black New Yorkers are even more likely now than they were even a year ago to have bail set or to be remanded to jail than their white counterparts. So there are multiple factors that are driving the increase in the jail population over the last year. A few of them. One, simply just increased arrests after the period of lockdown, that intense period here in New York City for those first few months. When those lifts were lifted, we saw an increase in the number of people arrested. But we're also seeing evidence that judges are setting bail more often and using supervised release less often than they could for those cases that are coming before them now. And we're also seeing that people are held for a longer period of time because of case delays. So there have been usual case delays that we've seen for many years, but they're now compounded here in New York and across the country by things like the inability to impanel grand juries and hold jury trials because of social distancing, as an example. So the staffing and management crisis and facilities crisis and conditions on Rikers need immediate attention. And yes, people are focused on them, but there is more to do. At the center, our focus is really about urging the city and supporting the city, the state, prosecutors, defenders, and the courts to act to decrease the population. So keeping people from going in to Rikers, addressing the court delays that are keeping them there for longer, and helping people to be released safely into the community. 4 years ago, the Center for Court Innovation, we were really privileged to coordinate the Littmann Commission, which is an independent commission that successfully argued for the closing of Rikers Island and presented a realistic plan to get there. The city has been moving forward on that, and I'm hopeful with the new mayor coming in shortly, and we'll see in the next few months that there will be support for continuing to close Rikers Island, even if there is disagreement about how we might do it. A few months ago, we released a second report in collaboration with the Littmann Commission, a roadmap to closing Rikers Island, 40 concrete data-driven recommendations for how to decrease the population safely to just under 3,000 people. One really important area that is critical to jail reform and addressing the crisis at Rikers is decreasing pretrial detention. So, as some of you may know, not now, 9 out of 10 people at Rikers are there because they can't post bail. And there's mounting evidence that in most cases, pretrial detention actually undermines public safety over the long term, in addition to compromising fairness and equity. And that's why we and other nonprofit organizations worked with the city a few years ago to create a community-based supervision program, the supervised release program, that offers voluntary services and compliance with court dates to help people stay in their community while they're awaiting trial. Early evaluation of that program was positive. It found that there was not an increase in rearrest for those that were in the program. And then current data that we've looked at shows positive results as well. So we saw that 87% of those in supervised release didn't miss a court date, 98 were compliant with all of the check-ins, and 87% were not rearrested on a felony charge. So we're working, especially at this time, along with our partners, to encourage judges, prosecutors to utilize supervised release in lieu of setting bail. In 2020, some of you may know that it was a sort of landmark year for bail reform here in New York. It was implemented in 2020. The bail reform law requires judges to release individuals who are charged with misdemeanors and almost all nonviolent felonies. And it's been pointed to as a cause of increase in gun violence in particular and other crime. Our research and other research is not pointing to that correlation at this time. So indeed, what we found is that many places across the country who had not enacted bail reform are seeing an uptick in violence, and certainly did in the early months of COVID and first year of COVID. So at this point, there's not evidence that it's connected to an increase in crime. I think we have some time we need to assess, but we're mindful of that critique and are concerned about, what it could mean to ensuring that people who shouldn't be in jail are released. Fortunately, we're seeing also a decrease in the number of of cases of violence as we hope that the city and the country is starting to recover from COVID. A second area of big focus for us is case delay. The chief judge here has made reducing case delays a real priority, but COVID has caused a backlog of cases again here in New York City and across the country. Over 60% of people now held pretrial are held more than 6 months, and an even higher percentage than before of people are held for more than a year and even more than 2 years. There's a complicated set of factors at play here, but we are hopeful about a pilot that we were able to run in Brooklyn with the court system that made an impact on reducing case delays in that pilot, and are hoping that we're going to be able to work to expand that, especially as we see the urgency with Rikers. And finally, we're working along with our peer organizations. We're working aggressively to identify people who could receive alternatives to jail and alternatives to prison through social services, treatment, mental health services, housing. And in fact, there's a new podcast that we just released in the last week that features an innovation in this area, the Felony Alternative to Incarceration Court, that you might want to check out. We're also working to have the city look at reinstating the early release program that we had worked on with the city, along with a few other organizations, to try to get people out of Rikers who are currently serving short sentences, to have them released to our supervision and care in lieu of being in jail. So these are just a few ways that the Center for Court Innovation is involved in this, this urgent need that I wanted to share. I also want to kind of pivot before we turn to the conversation with Darren to let you know that we do a lot of work in New York City with our operating programs. We run 24 or so operating programs across mostly in New York City, in courthouses and in communities. But we also work nationally with jurisdictions around the country, big and small, in all regions of the country, to help them improve their justice systems and achieve the same goals. One city that we've been focused on recently is Los Angeles. So Los Angeles has the largest jail population, roughly today around 14,000 people. Before COVID, it hovered closer to 15,000. And so even before the crisis of COVID-19, local governments, the local government was really wrestling with overcrowding. And a sort of recognition that there needed to be change in Los Angeles around the use of jail, especially for those with mental health issues. They recognize that roughly 33% of the population held in Los Angeles jails have a mental health need. Over the last few years, the county leadership through the Board of Supervisors has really deepened its focus on decarceration with this mantra of care first, jails last. And they've been investing in youth justice programs, mental health and substance treatment, and really trying to build up that community-based system of care. In 2020, remarkably, given that year, the county stood up a dedicated alternative to incarceration office that's led by a really accomplished and dynamic leader, Songhae Armstead, to rethink how LA responds to people in the criminal justice system. And we're really proud to be contributing in some way to this effort with the help of a dedicated team on the ground in LA, led by our terrific colleague, Chinma Ume. So a few things that we're working on. One is working on creating new programs and kind of taking some lessons from what we have done here in New York and other places, and bringing some of those ideas with us in our work in LA. So on one end, we're working on kind of the early end of the spectrum. We're working with cases that replicating an early diversion program that we created here in New York called Project Reset for low-level cases, trying to keep people from going into having any touch with the court system or any threat of a criminal record by diverting them early into short-term light touch programming to address what brought them in contact with the system in the first place. The next thing we're working on is for those who are arrested and brought to the police station is how to connect those folks right away to social services in lieu of having them go to jail while awaiting the next step in the process. And then the third thing that we're working on is on the other end of the spectrum, folks who are charged with more serious offenses, with felony cases, expanding the mental health and substance use treatment options that are available to use as alternatives to jail and to prison sentences. I mentioned that New York City, we're fortunate that we're rich relatively in alternative to incarceration programs, and we're working with others to help LA build out that same network of alternative to incarceration programs, especially focused on small organizations, small social service organizations, to really diversify and create a stronger network of community-based providers. And then the last thing that we're doing that I wanted to share is like in New York City, we're using our kind of data capacity and research policy expertise, as well as what we've learned here on the ground, to help the county and partners there to create a roadmap for closing the men's central jail in Los Angeles. So I now I wanted to turn to the subject of the conversation with my colleague, Deron Johnston. We know that safety and justice is not just about policing, prosecutors, and courts, that safety and justice must start in our neighborhoods, in our homes, in our schools, our streets. And over the last year or two especially, there's just been more and more urgent calls to find ways to right size or to shrink the role of the legal system in delivering safety and justice, and to look for more ways to support community-driven and community-centered approaches. So I'm proud to introduce Darren Johnson, who's leading a lot of this work at the center. We really wanted to create this platform today to offer insights and ideas from the actual people who are working directly with the communities that are most impacted and who really have the most at stake in this conversation. To not just hear from policy wonks, academics, and others on the speakers circuit. And last night, I was thinking about this session today, and last night, this terrific newsletter from a great writer and thinker named Courtney Martin hit my inbox. And this excerpt, I think, is a really fitting introduction for Darren and for the conversation with Darren today. Thought leadership needs a refresh. 21st century speaking should be about sharing great ideas and converting those ideas into action. That's what audiences are hungry for: fresh ideas, action, and impact. Too many speakers derive authority from fancy titles, overhyped books, and relationships formed with elite institutions and events. Not everyone worthy of being heard has written a best-selling book or been to Davos. It's time to uncover and elevate the voices of extraordinary individuals making impact in the world, both locally and globally. Wisdom comes from years spent in the classroom or organizing on the ground. It is rooted not in the years one has been on earth, but the creativity and innovation with which one has approached their calling. It's about time we honored that kind of wisdom. It's time to create an ecosystem of thought leaders who are young, brilliant, diverse, and making a difference in the world. This isn't just talk, it's about fresh ideas and a more just world. So with that, Darren, I know that feels kind of heavy, but I wanted to turn to you and ask you to first share your path to the Center for Court Innovation, and tell us a little bit about that path, but about the work that you do at the center.
Well, first, thank you for that introduction. That was definitely beautiful and big shoes to fill and words to live up to. Thank you for sharing what you shared prior to the introduction to Courtney. My path to the Center for Court Innovation, I guess in a very general sense, is life, right? Like, I come from the kinds of communities that the Center for Court Innovation is looking to support and looking to advocate around and have justice reform practices executed within. And so I can remember from a very young age experiencing challenges and knowing that my path is probably going to be connected to doing something about these challenges. I started thinking that, well, maybe it's around education. Maybe that's where I should start. Maybe I should be in a classroom supporting young minds and facilitating change through the classroom. So I started in public schools working in special education, who primarily the folks in those classrooms are who many of our programs now target for those of them that are in school. And eventually recognizing that the challenge is very interdisciplinary and very historical and systemic and woven into so many systems that just being in the classroom probably wouldn't be effective enough. And so I started looking for other ways to be impactful and to corral and support and connect with communities like the ones I come from in order to make those changes. And I wish that there was a more magical way of saying it, but there really isn't. I stumbled upon, our work in Brownsville, Brooklyn, who, my mother was a Brooklynite. I've been going back and forth from Brooklyn all my life. My best friend growing up, his family is from Brownsville and from Tilden houses. And I was familiar and thought, well, this might be the way, this might be the opportunity, being impressed by the Center for Court Innovation's focus and bravery in saying that something's wrong with these systems and we need to do something about it and change them, and wanting to do that in an innovative way, resident-led, that kind of thing. So I applied. I started as a case manager, working directly in community with residents, young people, supporting those who are most connected to the justice system, coming home from probation, maybe, or who are on probation or coming home from being incarcerated, or maybe they just got a desk appearance ticket. Maybe they're just challenged with the challenges our neighborhoods face. Poverty is pervasive, and they need a network of support in order to navigate that. And eventually, that work evolved to me leading some of that work in Brownsville. And now I'm currently the Deputy Director of Community Development and Crime Prevention for the Center for Court Innovation, which is a department within the center that focuses this work, a laser focus, if you will, in communities and micro communities that are experiencing these challenges. And that leads me to being here, having this conversation with you and our stakeholders on the line now.
Great. Thanks. And like you said, I think one of the unique features of our organization is that we do work hyper locally. We are sort of global and hyper local, and working in Brownsville, but the Brownsville Community Justice Center is an example of that. But we have a number of community-based programs for our Rockaway and Crown Heights and Bed-Stuy, with Neighbors in Action, the South Bronx, and others. We're still living living with COVID and its sort of grave impact on health, on schooling, on economic stability, on crime, and especially violence. You have been attending these convenings, kind of resident convenings called local stats, as part of our work with the Neighborhood Safety Initiatives program, where we work with partnership with the city, work with in NYCHA public housing developments throughout the city. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about what local stat is, what's kind of its purpose, and then again, sort of what are we hearing? What are you hearing? What are our colleagues hearing from residents at this time? Given where we are right now in this era, really this sort of post-COVID, but still COVID era, post George Floyd, but the reckoning continuing to be at the forefront of many of our minds, and people struggling with both a need for safety and also concern about policing and incarceration. So tell us about local stats and what are you hearing from people?
Yeah, well, I think first the impact of COVID on health, schooling, economic stability, crime, violence. These are issues that are arguably some of the most important components of life, right? Like we could make that argument that, these issues impact our residents' identity, their trajectory, the outcomes of their lives. Unfortunately, I think our communities sometimes experience barriers that stunt growth in these areas that are really needed. And so, our communities are strong in character, but sometimes fragile in infrastructure. That's like the best way that I can put it. And pandemics or economic downturns, any kind of added instability only exacerbates already existing challenges, right? So when we talk about COVID and its impact, a lot of the challenges that we see already existed in our cities' underbellies, and COVID exacerbates these things. The benefits of addressing these challenges, they're most importantly felt by those that are impacted the most, like addressing these challenges are important for those folks. But I think it's necessary to say that, to be honest, like all New Yorkers lose when communities and those infrastructures collapse, right? Like at the end of the day, the more challenged our communities are, the more resources and investments need to be invested in addressing those basic human conditions. And when all of your investment goes to basic human needs, you never quite get the chance to evolve to the next version of yourself, right? You're just focused on those basic human needs. And if our city wants to continue to evolve, like at all levels and all communities, it has to address these core issues that COVID exacerbated, that existed before COVID. This is kind of what NSI and neighborhood safety initiatives and local stat gets at. It specifically targets housing developments with acute challenges, and it gathers the experts to pinpoint and execute the solutions. And by experts, when I say that, I mean folks who are experiencing the challenges most acutely, right? Like close enough to the issues that they can spot solutions, right? To your point earlier about not just, leaning on the academics and the folks in ivory towers, right? But like actual community, residents and youth and seniors, folks that are impacted by this. So, these are public housing residents. These are marginalized micro communities. These are just as involved folks. And NSI connects these folks, right, to resources, be it financial resources, human capital, or physical supports in their communities, and has them designing interventions, installations, programs, solutions to long-standing, like life-challenging issues. These are the most important things in life. And local stat, what I've been seeing it's one component of that process and action, right? Our neighborhood, the NSI team does very layered work across the city with our public housing developments and our partners. The local stat events has our staff, the resident teams, and all these stakeholders activating spaces. They're sometimes it looks like block parties, sometimes it looks like festivals, sometimes they look like game days. There really are points of community and gathering for public housing developments that have been particularly neglected, alongside CBOs and agencies. And in these local stats, folk gather information. They focus on what residents are having challenges with and what they want to do to address those challenges. And then this information that's collected at all these local stats, we're talking about 17 housing developments across New York City, all 5 boroughs. That information is shared with key folks like local elected officials that can influence policy. It also steers $30,000 that these residents get to activate to address those actual issues and jumpstart a process of change. And so it leans on this participatory practice of putting the experts, not just having them at the table, but having them make decisions and be the primary beneficiary of changing what's happening in community and getting at the root, and having the experts, our young folks and our residents at the lead of that. That's what local stat is doing.
Can I ask about just the dynamics? Communities are not a monolith, and so even in those, those particular blocks or community developments, is there a generational, like, what are young people saying right now about what the needs are, and what are older residents or another kind of demographic? Like, where is there common and where is there difference in what residents are saying? These are the most important, these are the most important issues that need to be addressed.
Yeah, you're right. It's not monolithic, and our approach to addressing challenges is very specific to what that community actually needs. So the real answer to this question is, it depends. It depends on that micro community. It depends on that development that we're in. I could give some examples, right? So, our Queensbridge houses, for example, through engaging community, through local stats and surveying ballots, we had like 740, something like that, residents who really narrowed down 5 public safety issues that were impacting them in their lives. And this is, to your second point, an intergenerational group of folks. that are contributing to inputting on the solutions that need it. And they're talking about everything from improving unsafe conditions. They're talking about education and job training programs, destigmatizing mental health, reducing gun violence, and then youth, focusing on youth design projects. So, you know, of those 5 areas in Queensbridge, the one that rose to the top was reducing gun violence. You know, 28% of respondents wanted to focus on that. So in the coming months, they're going to go into trainings and develop designs and processes and figure out what is the best process to address gun violence. Now that looks different for another housing development in Wagner, for example. In Wagner houses in Harlem, they received around 800 votes from their development, and they wanted to focus on improvements to, you know, play in green spaces, right? Like public spaces. They wanted entrepreneurship programs and holistic and healing health programs, reentry, and again, youth. The one that rose to the top for them was improvements in play in green spaces. They got over 35% of their votes went there. So, you know, it is an intergenerational group. Sometimes, to your question, there is a difference in what the young folks want and what the older folks want. But the beauty of having these kinds of programs is, you know, NSI is able to create safe spaces for folks to actually tease out those differences and come up with solutions that everybody understands through, you know, a very egalitarian process. And so, you know, yes, differences exist, but ultimately folks rally around what the issue is that's rising to the surface for everyone and that impacts everyone. And then everyone's all hands on deck for implementing some kind of solution.
I know that people are going to there are a few questions that are going to come in. And so I want to leave some time for that. But before I go to that, I wanted to ask, speaking of violence, gun violence, and also about kind of green space. Earlier this month, I saw an op-ed in the New York Times from a physician who the title was "To Combat Gun Violence, Clean Up the Neighborhood." And her research showed that greening vacant lots and remediating abandoned homes significantly decreased gun violence, specifically in those neighborhoods. And I know that we've been doing, you know, you have experience in particular doing what we've called either placemaking or placekeeping work that's kind of like this in some of our community-based programs. And it just sort of affirmed for me that this approach to reducing violence is both about helping people and an individual focus, but also about place and the importance of attention there. Can you talk just a little bit about an example and give an example of where you've seen this actually, you've seen this happen and the kind of process that led to this placekeeping work that's led to a decrease in violence or other harms that the community was feeling?
1,000%. There's one in particular, an initiative that I worked on when I was at the Brownsville Community Justice Center. I think I want to share this one because it hits a number of points when we talk about the root causes of challenges that have us implement processes like placemaking, namely poverty, and how that intersects with safety. So the Belmont Revitalization Project centers on what we actually, like, what is safety, right? And what does safety actually mean? And for many of us, safety means freedom, right? That may sound trite, but safety, you know, can I wake up free from trauma? Can I wake up and access and explore the resources in my neighborhood in order to freely become who I need to become, right? Like freedom from all of the harrowing things that are a result of poverty, right? Like, poverty is pervasive in a way that debilitates this freedom. And to me, this is what our placemaking work and our Belmont Revitalization Project was really getting at. There are spaces in our micro neighborhoods where residents are not free from fear, right? They're not free they're not free from death. They're not free from jail. They're not free from trauma. They're not free from poverty. And so they can't freely navigate goals, you know? The Belmont Revitalization Project uses strategies such as crime prevention through environmental design to really look at where these spaces are exacerbated in communities. And we found that there was a space in Brownsville that was struggling with violence, that was struggling with neglect, which the economy wasn't there. There was a lot of substance abuse, homelessness, assaults, you name it. It was happening in this space. Essentially, we did what I spoke about earlier, right? We connected directly with residents and young folks who were impacted by this. And we listened to them. We listened to their stories. We listened to the experiences that they had here. And then those residents with us, we went to those spaces. We spent time in those spaces. We spoke with folks. We did surveying to really understand the fabric of what was happening in those spaces. And then we gathered the experts. These residents led us. They led the stakeholders, and those stakeholders ranged from, city services, right? The city agencies to CBOs, community boards, electeds, to first really implement small interventions to address directly what was happening in those spaces, and then assess those interventions, and then build long-term systemic structural changes that could start to reallocate resources back to these spaces, systems that can be led, structures that can be led by residents and community. We started developing quality of life committees. We started developing merchant associations in order to bring some structure and consistency, some long-term investment to these spaces. Eventually, we saw in this space a proliferation of local and citywide nonprofits converging on this space, all led by residents, all led by young folks. We had residents opening up businesses in this particular space, residents opening up nonprofits that were specifically trying to address the violence in the issue. And then we just saw an unprecedented amount of investment in this area once we brought the issue to the attention of these agencies. And these activations are continuing today. There's a large collaboration of folks. And essentially what this does is it addresses so many different issues, from identity, to investment, to hope, and pushes our work forward in a very interdisciplinary, resident community-led way. And toolkits get developed out of this. They get shared with agencies across disciplines, and allows us the ability to implement these strategies in multiple cities and neighborhoods across the city. So that's one example. I do just want to say there are many others. If there are any folks that have questions about this or other examples of this work, please do not hesitate to reach out.
Thank you. And we'll make sure, your contact information is shared, and mine too, for folks who want to follow up. This is meant to be a sort of intro to not a comprehensive. So want to make sure that we're available for that. We've gotten a few questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of them, but we will, by the way, if you asked a question, we will respond, share a response to you, so you're not just left out there. There was two that I wanted to combine. It's really building on what you shared, Darren, is sort of what the role of police and what the role of property owners, and maybe you can give the example of Brownsville, if that's most relevant. What's been the role, if at all, and sort of what's your hope or what you would like to see?
This is a deep question. What we saw, the elephant in the room often is that, yes, there is often a contentious relationship and history between law enforcement and our communities. That clearly was exacerbated during the pandemic. To be completely honest, that area still needs a lot of work. I'm not going to paint, an unrealistic picture. What I will say is that what our work has revealed when developing these committees and these groups is that, police are also very aware that they may not be the best folks to address many of these issues. And they have been more willing over the past years to own that and to say that out loud, and to talk to organizations and residents and leaders to identify, well, who's the best person to do this? Who actually are the resources? Because we're not the best folks to be doing some of this work. And that is the reason why, amongst many other reasons, there's contention between the two. I will say quickly to the role of property owners. This is layered as hell. So excuse my language. Property owners, we're talking about in Brownsville alone, there are properties where, property owners who are folks that are not from the community, look like the community, or represent the community, own property that is blighted, that has been taken from them, and it's just left there vacant, and organizing around those spaces is stalled because of bureaucracy, right? Property owners also goes to folks who sometimes have a vested interest in not keeping the property up because they're trying to protect something else. And so our work has forced us to connect with property owners to directly address these issues, direct city agencies and stakeholders towards solutions, and sometimes bringing a multidisciplinary group of folks to the table. And sometimes that requires an organization like ours or local residents just to highlight the challenge and the fact that bureaucracy is keeping progress from happening around these vacant lots or these distressed areas that aren't being tended to. So yeah, that's a really interesting and layered one. We could talk about the intersection between home ownership and mobility out of poverty, and how this is a pathway. Home ownership, and the fact that Brownsville has the highest concentration of public housing in the country. There's an intersection there, and there are institutions and groups working on innovative ways to really draw attention to that issue and come up with new solutions. There's definitely not, I'm already over time. There's not enough time here to unpack all of this, but again, I love that question, and I'd be excited to talk to whomever about it some more.
Great, thank you. Man, it's hard to do this. I know we were instructed, let's make it short and just it's the tip of the iceberg, which is all right, and it does feel really, really challenging. We are essentially over time right now, but I did want to just honor a couple of questions that people asked that I can answer, I think, and then get to, and then we'll end and thank everyone for joining. This goes back to the presentation or the information I shared around Rikers in particular. And it was a question about the number of people who are incarcerated and the way I'm kind of framing the conversation is how to decarcerate Rikers. What is our approach, or how we're seeing that? And I would point to, I think we may put in the chat, but we essentially developed a plan with this roadmap to closing Rikers Island, these recommendations for how to, we saw it a sort of pragmatic approach to reducing the population as swiftly as possible, recognizing that there is always a question about what is the right use, if there is a right use ever, of jail. But we wanted to be able to offer something that can be implemented and that we felt like could have support from law enforcement, defense attorneys, the community, courts. And so that was the basis of these recommendations. And they are based on, our kind of research and data analysis, and we can share that out. There's a question around bail reform. And if we had judges, if we had talked to judges or surveyed judges about why they are using bail in lieu of supervised release. And we have not done a survey, but we are working really closely with judges who are, overwhelmed, I think, in trying to manage the backlog of cases, as well as the operations that are not, that are virtual, that in many cases, but for arraignments and just really challenging conditions. But we are kind of taking the approach of providing training and individual relationship building with judges, and hoping to share, especially as we have more recent information, positives about the program, so that they can understand the impact of the program and hopefully feel more confident in its use. And then the last thing is around about community-centered. There was a question around metal detectors, actually, in courts, and probably not just in courts, but how our community justice centers in particular can create safety and a feeling of belonging and fairness when, you know, you have the balance of security. And I'm not a security expert, so I don't know how to implement something without metal detectors. But what I can say is, and this is sort of a core value of the Center for Court Innovation's work, is the tenets of procedural justice are really important in terms of how people come into a space. One can feel that they are treated fairly, that there is that the court staff, and that it's a space where not just court operations are happening, but a place to seek help at some of our community justice centers is really important for people's sense of dignity, fairness, and equity as they come into a court space. So I think that it is possible to achieve that even when you do have security, that we can do both, and it's not perfect, and it's dependent on people to implement it. But we've, I think, you know, in some of our projects have had some success there and some lessons to share that we can offer to the person who asked that question. There are a few other questions that we will be happy to share answers to over email, and then also share our contact information again. I want to thank you, the audience, for joining us and for your engagement in this work. I really want to thank you, Darren, my colleague, who I respect so deeply and who is doing just the tremendous work to actually live, you know, the values that we hope to have as a society, as an organization, and who is doing the work of lifting up the solutions, the wisdom, and the needs of the people that we serve. So thank you all very much for joining us for this short session, and we look forward to hearing from you and hopefully you joining another one in the near future. Thank you.